If your last name is Navajo, you have been carrying a secret your entire life. Not a rumor, not a guess. A real historical trace, buried inside a surname you probably never questioned. Some of these names were carved onto census rolls by government agents who barely understood the language they were rewriting. Others survived from a creation story older than any nation on this continent. By the end of this list, you will understand why the final name on it does not just belong to a family. It belongs to one of the most consequential resistance leaders in Navajo history. Number 10. Yazzie. It looks like a simple name. It is not. Yazzie comes from Yazzie, meaning little one or beloved son. On the surface, that sounds gentle, almost forgettable. But follow it back and the story turns sharper. When federal census takers moved through Navajo communities in the early 1900s, they were ordered to assign fixed, English-legible surnames to people who had never used a surname system in their life. A descriptive word, a nickname, a term of affection inside one family, became a permanent legal identity stamped across generations. Yazzie is now one of the most common Navajo surnames in existence, which means it did not just survive. It multiplied, quietly, family by family, until an entire nation was carrying a word that once simply meant the little one in someone's home. That is not a small detail. A term of love became a fixed identity under government pressure, and it held. Here is what almost nobody notices about that word. Yazzie was never meant to be permanent. In traditional practice, a Navajo person could carry different descriptive names across a lifetime, tied to circumstance, not to bureaucracy. A government system built for European-style inheritance had no category for that kind of fluid identity, so it grabbed whatever word was closest and froze it in place. That is why one soft, affectionate word ended up standing in for an entire administrative concept it was never designed to hold, and why so many unrelated families across the reservation now share it. The next name did not start as a surname at all. It started as a description of someone else's son. Number 9. Begay. If you know one Navajo surname, it is probably this one. Begay comes from Begay, meaning his son, a patronymic tag that once simply pointed toward a father, not a family line. Census officials fixed it into a permanent surname the same way they fixed hundreds of others, and it spread until Begay became attached to some of the most recognized names in 20th century Navajo history, including families connected to the Navajo Code Talkers, the Marines who built an unbreakable code out of their own language during World War II. The government that once tried to erase that language in boarding schools was, within a generation, relying on it to win battles in the Pacific. If this is your surname, the old records point toward something much larger than a spelling. They point toward a language the United States military once needed to survive. There is a harder irony underneath that story too. The same federal system that once punished Navajo children for speaking their own language in boarding school classrooms turned around, one generation later, and asked young men carrying names like Begay to speak that same language into military radios because no enemy codebreaker on Earth could understand it. A surname built from his son ended up wrapped around one of the most effective military codes of the entire war. The next surname sounds like a compliment. It was actually a description that stuck for life. Number 8. Tsosi. The root is tsosi, meaning slender or thin. A physical trait given as a personal name to one person, later frozen into a surname carried by thousands. That is the pattern running through almost every Navajo family name on this list, and it is worth sitting with for a second. These were not hereditary house names built to project power across centuries, the way a European noble title might be. They were living descriptions, changed with each generation, until outside administrators demanded permanence. Tsosi is proof that an entire naming philosophy was rewritten in a single generation, and the word that survived the rewrite was never meant to outlive the person it first described. Think about how strange that actually is. Somewhere, generations back, one specific person was slender, and a community used that fact the way you might use a nickname today. Nobody in that moment imagined the word would end up on tribal enrollment cards, school rosters, and marriage certificates for descendants who might not share that physical trait at all. The description outlived the body it described. The next entry is not about a person at all. It is about what a family owned. Number 7. Manygoats. This one is almost a direct translation, and that is exactly what makes it interesting. In the traditional Navajo economy, livestock was not just food. It was wealth, status, and survival, especially after generations of upheaval left many families rebuilding from almost nothing. A household known for large herds of goats carried real standing in its community. When that household needed an English surname, officials often translated the description literally instead of inventing something unrelated, which is why a name like Manygoats reads today almost like a window straight into a family's economic position a century ago. Most people never hear that part. A surname that sounds almost too plain in English was, in its own community, a marker of resilience and resourcefulness. It also marks something quieter and sadder if you sit with the timeline. Livestock wealth among Navajo families was deliberately targeted in the 20th century, during federally mandated stock reduction programs in the 1930s that forced families to slaughter huge portions of their herds in the name of erosion control. A surname built on abundance survived into an era when the very thing it described was being taken away by policy, which makes the name itself a kind of quiet record of what was lost. The next name ties a person permanently to somebody else's identity. Number 6. Benally. The root is Benally, understood as his grandchild. And in some family lines, it also carries a connection to specific clan relationships. This is where Navajo surnames start to diverge sharply from a name like Smith or Johnson. A Western surname usually marks a father's line, permanently, in one direction. A name like Benally can gesture toward relationship itself, toward the person you belong to inside a kinship system that runs through grandparents and clans as much as through a single father. The spelling looks ordinary. The relationship encoded inside it is not. If this name is in your family, it is quietly pointing toward a kinship structure most outsiders never fully understand, one where identity was never just about one parent. Under the traditional system, a person is described as born to their mother's clan and born for their father's clan, and a maternal uncle often carries real authority in a child's life. A name like Benally is a small linguistic echo of that entire structure, a reminder that the family map behind it runs in more directions than a single family tree ever could. Now the story turns towards something older than any government record. Number 5. Totachin, sometimes written Totachin. It comes from Todich Iini, the Bitterwater clan. One of the 4 original clans that Navajo tradition holds were given at the very beginning through Astzon Nadlehe, known in English as Changing Woman. This is where the emotional register of this list has to shift. A surname like Totachin is not a government invention layered onto a family. It is a fossil of the oldest social structure the Diné people have. Older than any reservation boundary, older than any treaty, older than the United States itself. Families across the Navajo Nation still identify by this clan today, and the surname is simply the modern shadow of that older, deeper identity. This is where the name turns dangerous to underestimate. Everyone who carries a version of this name is connected, at least in name, to a story that predates written history in this hemisphere. Today, there are more than 100 recognized Navajo clans, but tradition holds that 4 came first, and the Bitterwater clan is one of them. That means a surname like Totachin is not describing a job, a trait, or an event. It is describing a place inside the origin structure of an entire people. A structure still recited out loud every time a Navajo person introduces themselves by naming their 4 clans in order. The next name belonged to the people other families were careful not to provoke. Number 4. Natonaba. This one carries real weight. The root points toward he fights with, or he contends against, language tied to conflict, defense, or resistance rather than to occupation or geography. Names like this became attached to families during some of the hardest decades in Navajo history, the period surrounding forced removal in the 1860s, when U.S. military campaigns pushed thousands of Navajo people off their land and marched them hundreds of miles to imprisonment at Bosque Redondo, an episode still remembered as the Long Walk. Families carrying a name rooted in fighting or resistance were not decorative. They were describing exactly what that generation had to do to survive. That is not folklore. That is documented in military records, treaty negotiations, and oral history passed down inside the nation itself. A name like this did not just survive a hard century, it described one. The Long Walk itself is one of the most brutal chapters in the entire history of the American Southwest. Hundreds of miles on foot, hunger, exposure, and death along the route, followed by years of confinement at Bosque Redondo under conditions so harsh that the U.S. government's own inspectors eventually admitted the policy had failed. A surname rooted in resistance did not emerge from a comfortable century. It emerged from one of the worst. The next surname belonged to someone whose job was to speak with the spirit world, not just the material one. Number 3. Kla, closely tied to Hatawi, meaning singer or medicine practitioner, someone trained in the long, precise ceremonial chants that hold Navajo religious and healing practice together. This role carried enormous authority inside the community, comparable in weight, if not in structure, to a religious office in almost any other culture on this list. One of the most documented bearers of this tradition is Hosteen Kla, a renowned medicine man and weaver in the early 20th century, whose ceremonial knowledge and artistry were recorded by ethnographers and museums, preserving chants and sand painting traditions that might otherwise have been lost entirely. If your family carries this name, the old records point toward a person whose job was literally to restore balance, hojo, for an entire community. That is not a small inheritance to carry in a surname. Ceremonial singers like this trained for years, sometimes decades, memorizing chants that could run for 9 consecutive nights without a single line out of order, because a mistake was believed to undo the very healing the ceremony was meant to bring. A name tied to that role is not decorative. It is a record of discipline most modern professions could not match. The next name marked someone the community trusted to lead in open conflict. Number 2. Haski. The root connects to warrior, or a title of marshal standing inside the community, a name given to someone recognized for courage or leadership in defense of their people. Names like this cluster around the same violent decades as Natonaba, the era of U.S. military expansion into Navajo territory, cavalry campaigns, and the eventual imprisonment at Bosque Redondo under the 1868 treaty that finally allowed the Navajo Nation to return to a portion of its homeland. A surname built on the idea of a warrior was not abstract in that century. It was a functional role, filled by real people, in a real and devastating conflict. Most people scrolling past a name like this in a phone directory have no idea it once marked someone the whole community depended on when danger arrived. And unlike a European knight's title, this was not granted by a crown. It was earned in the field, recognized by the community itself, and passed forward informally until it hardened into a surname that outlasted the war that produced it. And now the name that changes the scale of everything on this list. Number 1. Manuelito. If you know Navajo history at all, this name should stop you cold. Manuelito was a real, documented Navajo leader, one of the principal figures in the resistance against forced removal in the 1860s. He fought U.S. military campaigns for years rather than surrender his people's land, was eventually forced into imprisonment at Bosque Redondo alongside thousands of others, and later became one of the signers of the 1868 treaty that secured the Navajo Nation's return to its homeland, a return almost no other removed nation in American history was ever granted. He went on to serve as head of the Navajo Nation's own police force, working to hold his people together during the fragile decades of rebuilding that followed. Descendants and families connected to his name and legacy carry a surname tradition tied not to myth, but to signed treaties, military correspondence, and a documented return from exile that reshaped the entire nation's future. This is not folklore dressed up for a video. This is one of the most consequential names in the documented history of the Navajo Nation, attached to a leader whose decisions still shape where the Navajo Nation stands today. What makes this final name different from every other entry on this list is scale. Yazzie, Sozi, Manygoats, Benally, all of them trace individual families through individual moments. Manuelito's name sits at the center of the entire nation's turning point, the difference between permanent exile and the return home that made everything after it, the reservation, the code talkers, the modern Navajo Nation government, possible in the first place. Every name before this one is a thread. This is the knot they are all tied to. 10 names. 10 completely different kinds of survival. A word for little one that multiplied across a nation. A patronymic that ended up tied to Marines who built an unbreakable code out of their own language. A clan name older than any government paperwork, reaching back to Changing Woman herself. A name built from the word fight, carried by families who had no choice but to live up to it. A surname is never just a label. It is a compressed history of land, language, faith, war, and endurance, folded down into something small enough to fit on a driver's license. None of this means every person carrying these names descends from the exact figures mentioned here, and it does not need to. What it means is that the name itself belongs to a real tradition, tied to real records, real clans, and real history, not an invented legend built for a headline. That is what makes it worth taking seriously in the first place. If one of these names is yours, or close to yours, tell us in the comments. Tell us your clan, your family's story, the region you come from, or the surname you want decoded next. Somewhere in this comment section is another name waiting to be opened.